Thank you for inviting us to speak, and thanks for the introduction, Ashika. My name is Dr. Antoinette Miric. I'm a psychiatrist from Johannesburg, and we were approached to discuss some mental health issues with the doctors who are manning the call center lines. And our presentation is entitled The Mental Health of Doctors and Their Patients During the Time of the COVID-19 Pandemic, the African Context. I am co-presenting with Dr. Tina Siderides, who is a clinical psychologist who is working with me on a mental health response for healthcare workers in Gauteng. So when we look at the mental health aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm thinking of you as my colleagues who are managing a call line, and I am wondering what kind of calls are coming through. I know a lot of them are clinical, but I suspect there's quite a lot of emotional content as well, and that is what we're going to focus our presentation on. So how are the patients doing? What is happening emotionally for them? So recently, SADC, South African Anxiety and Depression Group, did an online survey between the 2nd and the 14th of April 2020. They received over 1,200 responses. 85% were female, between the ages of 26 and 45, and mostly were Gauteng based, and there was 60% employed. Notably, 16% of that survey lived alone. So the findings were, and these are just the emotional, the one section of the survey, 59% of people felt very stressed or stressed before the lockdown, and 65% are feeling very stressed during the lockdown. Despite the small increase in stress, a massive 92% of that whole population supported the lockdown. However, these are the emotions and conditions and struggles which they are experiencing, which I'm sure is coming through in the call lines. 55% are experiencing anxiety and panic, 46% financial stress, so I suspect that's directly fueling the anxiety and panic, 40% depression, 30% poor family relations, 12% feelings of suicide, which is quite a high percentage. It's about 120 out of that population, and 6% are struggling with substance abuse. So we've looked at the patients. Now I want to look at the doctors, because you are the ones who are manning this call line. So I want to understand also how your emotional state is. And I'll explain a bit more about my reasoning. There was a recent survey done on the EM Guidance app, which is a clinical app, which I'm sure some of you know about. They were able to do the survey of 3,000 healthcare workers and resulted in about 1,500 doctors responding to the survey. They looked at various aspects, and part of their survey was looking at the emotional health of doctors. This is an interesting graph. If you look on the right, you'll see the labels there. Red is angry, peach is anxious, orange is frustrated, green is happy. And if we look a little bit, and if I can zoom in a bit, I think most of you are from Natal. So there's lots of anxiety and overwhelmness here. In Gauteng, there's a lot of anger and anxiety here. So I'm wondering what that's about. And then if you look in Namibia, I'm assuming it was a small sample, but that person's pretty happy. And if you look actually more in the rural areas, there are quite a lot of isolated, happy people, which reflects the pandemic where we are, with Gauteng, Western Cape, and Natal being the hotspots. And then this is just another slide showing the same results. The writing is quite small, so it might be a bit difficult to see, but what you can see here is these are looking at doctors in the public service and looking at their different emotions. So significantly, except for the general practice doctors, and I'm not sure how representative that is, over 50% of doctors are anxious. It seems like the the older you are and the younger you are, the more angry you get. So the specialists, there's about a 3% emotion, prominent emotion being anger, and community service also 4% being anger. There's also a lot of frustration and feeling of overwhelmness. So overall, about a good 90% of emotions are what we call more negative emotions. They're not necessarily unhealthy, but they are more taxing to deal with. So how does this relate to you? I need you to understand that you are the doctors who are helping patients, and doctors and nurses, I think, are running through to the lines on the front line. And if we can help you understand perhaps what your emotional state may be at this time, what the doctors and nurses phoning in's emotional state may be, and the patient's state may be, I think if we are able to just understand it a bit better, it will make for a smoother operation. So what makes COVID-19 so different in terms of our emotional responses? And this relates to both doctors and for patients. But if we look at doctors specifically, this impacts us directly and personally. So we not only have concerns about ourselves, we have concerns about family and friends, and concerns about colleagues becoming ill. And it's unlike other crises, example, HIV, which I'm sure many of you, like me, were part of, where in the early 2000s there was no ARVs, and it was an absolute disaster working in the hospitals at that stage. However, there wasn't as much of an emotional response in the healthcare workers at that time, and that is because of the differences in the way this pandemic has worked out. One of the big issues, and this is for you and your patients and for other doctors, is there's a complete and utter information overload. And I think that's why a line like yours is good, where you're getting streamlined advice, hopefully from one or two sources, and it's consistent methods going over. I haven't even sat down to look at all the specific advice in terms of COVID-19, and I see articles flying around all the time, but I would, for myself, I'd probably choose one point of reference, like the NICD, in order to find that information. But many of your patients are getting information from everywhere. They're getting from the government, they're getting from social media, and many of our colleagues, we're all on these WhatsApp groups where the articles are coming through thick and fast. The other reason this anxiety is so strong in South Africa is because we've been watching this play out all over the world, and we're in a phase of what we call anticipatory anxiety. So we know that something is coming. We are just not sure how high the wave is going to be, how big the wave is going to be, how intense it's going to be, and how long it's going to last. And that uncertainty is driving the anxiety. And obviously with that uncertainty is the economic aspects. But if we're looking specifically at health, this is the major problem. One thing I'd like to explain to you in terms of COVID-19 phases, we've obviously got the curve phases and the pre, early, mid-peak of the pandemic, and then post. But we also look at this in terms of mental health, and it's useful to think of this whole thing as a battle. And we know that emotionally there are going to be different phases that yourself and your patients are going to go through. We are sitting in the moment in this preparation and early phase, where there's large amounts of anticipatory anxiety, and as I said, panic. Our sense of control has been taken away. And I say sense of control because I think we're quickly realizing we never really were in control. And it's one of the strengths of our profession, but also a potential weakness, that we struggle when things are not completely in our control. Then the mental health impact, and this is both healthcare workers and the public, will move to the mid phase and the peak phase. Now, specifically for healthcare workers, this phase is when the most psychological struggles occur. people generally can respond in kind of a robot mode or very, very high adrenaline mode and work really, really hard. But as you know, you're much more prone to sudden bursts of exhaustion at that stage. Or people just work so hard that they just burn out. And this is where we watch for the emotional reactions. During this time, the early, mid, and peak phase is when people get more irritable, they argue more, they become more about silly things on Teams. And this is what we need to watch out for in terms of our fellow colleagues and healthcare workers. The tail off and post-COVID phase, well, we don't know when that's going to happen, but research does tell us that this is when, actually, research is quite positive here in terms of healthcare workers. In terms of healthcare workers, the research does indicate that the majority of healthcare workers will be able to recover during this phase in terms of emotional recovery. And often people look back at the work they've done and are quite fulfilled, and they feel like they've gone through some process of development. However, there is a small minority of colleagues where we need to watch out for during this phase in terms of PTSD, increased substance abuse, and depression. I want to explain to you the concept of bad stress versus stress resilience. And this applies once again to healthcare workers, but it applies to the public who you are going to be talking to. So we all know that everyone is very stressed, and we are and we will continue to experience high levels of stress in the months to come. Stress is basic to our everyday survival, and our stress responses allow us to prepare and face challenging times. However, when you look at this diagram, when stress is unpredictable and severe and uncontrolled, it can lead us to feel very out of control and unable to manage. Prolonged extreme stress shapes our brains and makes us more vulnerable to develop depression, anxiety, PTSD. When it's predictable, moderate, and controlled, it leads to a tolerance of coping with it and a resiliency. And this is where we need to shape our day-to-day life so that stress remains as predictable, as moderate as possible. The one thing which I say to my friends and my patients is the only thing certain is that everything is uncertain. And if you are able to, understand that and understand that it is predictable, that it's going to be uncertain, and not get too overwhelmed by every single bump along the way, you can have a more predictable, moderate, controlled response to stressful events. These two graphs are from a psychologist in the States, Bruce Perry, who works for the Neurosequential Network, and he's done a lot of work on specifically trauma within children, but he has done quite a bit of work on stress during this time. So once again, you've got the pattern of stress. So you've got the chaotic, severe, prolonged, and you've got the predictable, moderate, and controllable. And this is more when you're more vulnerable to stress, and this is when you're more resilient to stress. So these are factors that make you more vulnerable to stress. And these are common knowledge, you know this, but I am going to say this because even I mess up some of these. If you don't have a daily structure, if you're comfort eating, if there's too much media, social media, minimal exercise, emotional isolation, self-focus, sleep disruption, negative, and ruminative. So you can see that the patients who are prone to mental illness will be struggling with these things. And these are specific areas that you can advise, if people are phoning and they're really struggling. These are very, very simple things which work if you discuss, what is your daily structure looking like? Which is understanding that their daily structure looks very different. When we are looking at what makes someone more resilient to stress, and this now once again applies to healthcare workers and the patients, is having a daily structure, having family meals, limited media, exercise, reaching out, helping others, which I suppose is instinctive to all of us, hence why you're on this line and I'm doing this presentation. sleep hygiene, and positive and future focus. By saying this, I'm not denying the real economic impact that we are working through and the poverty. And obviously those need active measures to be put in place. But that is a part of why people struggle emotionally. And you can imagine if people are struggling emotionally, they will struggle to even reach out for perhaps things that are available, food parcels. And it's about trying to just explain to them how, certain things can help them every day. So one of the big things is about pausing to self-regulating. And we did the mindfulness exercise right in the beginning, and we're doing them in this presentation to remind you that it is necessary to pause. And sometimes the only way we do it is if we force it. Protective factors to increase the capacity to self-regulate: sufficient sleep, COVID-free bedtime. So please, we need to turn off phones, we need to turn off WhatsApp groups, stay hydrated, eat regular meals, and social connection. And I'm going to end there, but basically the important bit is just to remember to breathe and go back to your breath when you're feeling really, really stressed. This you can do within your work, this you can do when you get a difficult call, but it is to just take some time.